It was a quiet morning in mid-October, the kind where the sun casts a soft golden hue across the porch and time seems to slow just enough for reflection. George, 71, sat by his kitchen window with a steaming cup of black coffee, flipping through his mail. Most of it was junk. Insurance offers, a magazine he no longer read, a few bills. But one envelope stood out. Cream-colored, no return address, just his name, written in shaky but determined handwriting. He opened it out of curiosity. Dear stranger, if you're reading this, you're around 70 years old. You're younger than me, just young enough to avoid the regrets I now carry like stones in my pockets. I'm 92. My name is Walter. I don't have much time left, but I wanted to say a few things. Things I wish someone had told me when I was your age. Maybe it wouldn't have changed everything, but maybe it would have changed something. George blinked. He read the letter 3 times. Each sentence landed with more weight than the last. Regrets about missing chances, about playing it safe, about letting fear speak louder than joy. George had never heard of this project called Letters from the Future. But this letter, it felt like someone had broken into his mind and written down thoughts he didn't dare speak aloud. He folded the letter carefully, placed it on the table, and sat back. Outside, a breeze moved the leaves. Inside, something began to stir. That night, George couldn't sleep. He kept hearing Walter's words. Time doesn't hurt your body. It hurts your soul when you waste it. He thought about his days, how they all looked the same now. Wake up, coffee, news, a short walk, sometimes, more TV than he liked to admit. A call from his daughter, maybe, go to bed, repeat. He hadn't felt truly alive since his wife, Linda, passed 5 years ago. Since then, the house had gone quiet, not just around him, but inside him too. The letter haunted him in the best way, not because it was sad, but because it was honest. Walter talked about how he used to avoid mirrors, not because of the wrinkles, but because they reminded him of the man he used to be, full of fire, adventure, and ideas. George felt that. He had once taught literature at a local high school. He used to write poetry. He used to dance with Linda in the living room, barefoot, without music. But somewhere along the way, he stopped writing, stopped dancing, stopped living like he mattered. Walter's words had a strange power. They weren't telling George to change. They were asking him to remember who he was. And for the first time in years, George stood in front of the hallway mirror, looked into his own eyes, and whispered, "I'm not done yet." A few days later, George mentioned the letter to Emily, his neighbor and longtime friend. She was 68, vibrant, always suggesting he get out more, which he politely declined. But this time, she leaned forward with interest. "Letters from the future. I've heard of that. A group of seniors from the retirement home downtown started it. They write letters to people a few years younger, hoping someone will listen before it's too late." Emily offered to take George to the center where the project was born, Willow Creek Senior Living. He hesitated, but curiosity had its claws in him. When they arrived, the walls were covered with handwritten letters, pinned like memories that refused to fade. Some were typed, others scribbled. All of them carried the same message: live while you can. Love while you can. Don't wait. A woman named Susan, the project coordinator, explained, "It started when one of our residents, Walter, said, 'What's the point of wisdom if you don't pass it on?' So they began writing, not for sympathy, for impact." George felt like he was standing in a room full of whispers from the future. Some letters spoke of missed chances at love, others of not forgiving fast enough, or staying quiet when it mattered most. He spotted Walter's name on a bulletin board, dozens of letters written by him. Walter wasn't trying to be wise. He was trying to stop someone else from hurting the way he had. George walked out of Willow Creek carrying more than a paper. He carried a mirror, one that reflected not what he'd lost, but what he could still become. Back at home, George sat in his recliner, the same chair he'd spent hundreds of afternoons in, half watching TV, half napping, fully fading. He looked at the corner where his walking cane rested, and the framed photo of Linda smiling, caught mid-laugh at a family picnic. For years, George told himself he was resting, but now he realized he'd stopped participating in life. Walter's words rang louder. Inactivity doesn't protect you, it erases you, one quiet day at a time. George stood up, slowly, joints stiff, breath shallow. But he moved. He laced up his old walking shoes, still dusty from the last time he wore them, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the sidewalk uneven, but each step felt like a rebellion. 2 blocks in, he felt the tightness in his back, the tremble in his knees. He almost turned around, almost. Then he saw a little boy on a bike wave at him, and he waved back. That one simple moment brought warmth to his chest, the kind he hadn't felt in years. He sat on a bench beneath a tree, heart pounding, but soul humming. He remembered what Walter wrote. It's not about how far you walk, it's about remembering that you still can. When George got home, he looked around the living room. Everything was in its place. That was the problem. So he moved a few things, changed the position of the armchair, dug through a drawer and found an old notebook, the one he used to write poems in. He opened to a blank page and wrote 3 words, "Begin again, George." The next morning, George woke up before the sun, not out of restlessness, but purpose. He hadn't felt that in years. He made coffee, pulled on a worn jacket, and went outside for another walk. Just 15 minutes this time. But it was enough. Enough to feel a little blood moving, a little oxygen clearing the fog in his thoughts. Later that afternoon, Emily knocked on his door. "I heard you've been moving again," she said with a smirk. "Careful, you might start enjoying it." George laughed. A real one, the kind that doesn't feel like borrowed air. Emily invited him to join her for a senior yoga class. He almost said no, then remembered Walter's line, "Say yes to invitations, even if you don't feel ready." So he went. The class was light, filled with quiet music, gentle movements, and seniors of all shapes and ages, all trying. All choosing effort over comfort. He didn't stretch far, didn't move fast, but he was there. That mattered more. Afterward, someone complimented his balance. Someone else asked if he'd return. George felt noticed, and for the first time in a long time, not invisible. That evening, he dusted off an old photo album, one filled with memories he'd avoided. Vacations, birthday parties, Linda holding his hand by the lake. He smiled. And as he flipped through the pages, he whispered, "I'm not just remembering these, I'm going to make more." A few days later, George did something unexpected. He texted his grandson, Jake. The message was simple. "Hey, you up for lunch with your old grandpa this weekend?" Jake replied almost instantly. "Absolutely, I'd love that." They met at a diner near Jake's college. The booth was worn, the food was average, but the conversation was gold. Jake shared stories about classes, his girlfriend, and a business idea he'd been working on. George listened, really listened, and found himself excited by his grandson's mind. "Grandpa," Jake said, "you seem different, happier." George smiled. "I got a letter from a 92-year-old stranger, and I think he might have saved my life." Jake laughed, confused but intrigued. Later, they walked together through a nearby park. George told stories from his youth, things Jake had never heard, How he once hitchhiked across 3 states, how he met Linda at a bookstore, how he used to write poetry by candlelight. Jake was amazed. "Why didn't you ever tell me these stories before?" George paused. "Because I forgot I was still allowed to be interesting." They sat on a bench, side by side, generations apart, but suddenly connected. Jake grabbed George's phone. "I'm putting my number on speed dial, and next weekend, we're grabbing coffee again. No excuses." As George walked back home that evening, he didn't just feel proud, he felt alive. The letter from Walter hadn't just opened a door. It invited him back into his own life. The next week, George returned to Willow Creek, holding the letter close to his chest. He was determined to meet Walter, the man whose words had changed everything. Susan greeted him at the door, but her expression shifted when he asked about Walter. "George, I'm so sorry. Walter passed away 2 days ago." The news hit like a stone to the chest. "He was asking about you," she added. "He hoped someone would visit. He didn't know your name, just said, 'I hope the letter got to him.'" George swallowed hard. The air felt heavier. Susan handed him a small envelope. "Walter left this with me. He said if someone came looking for him, this was for them." It was another letter, but this time not to a stranger, to himself. "Dear Walter, you waited too long. You played it too safe. You stopped taking risks. You told yourself you were wise when really, you were scared. I forgive you. But if someone younger ever reads this, tell them, be bolder, be kinder, move your body, speak your truth. You don't get to rewind. You only get to wake up one more time." George sat in the lobby, holding the letter with both hands, his eyes filled with tears, not just for Walter, but for all the things that go unsaid, for all the people who leave this world still waiting to begin again. That night, George made a decision. He wouldn't let Walter's wisdom die with him. George began planning something simple, yet bold. He called it the Afternoon That Matters. A small event at the local park, live music, a few lawn chairs, and an open mic for anyone over 60 to share a story they'd never told before. He posted flyers at the community center and left handwritten notes in mailboxes. Emily helped. Jake made a website. Even Susan sent word through Willow Creek. But as the day approached, doubt crept in. What if no one comes? What if it's just me and a microphone? The old voices returned, the ones that whisper, "You're too old, too late, too tired." But then he remembered Walter's final words. "You don't get to rewind. You only get to wake up one more time." On the morning of the event, the sky was blue and wide. George arrived early, setting up folding chairs with Jake. A local guitarist tuned his strings. The mic stood ready. For a long while, no one came, but then, one couple, then another, then a woman with a walker, then a small group from Willow Creek, and finally, Emily, with 2 cups of coffee. "Told you this would work," she smiled. George stood at the mic. His hands shook, but his voice was steady. "We were told that life slows down with age, but maybe we just stop speeding it up with things that don't matter. I got a letter from someone who regretted waiting. I'm here today because I don't want that letter to be wasted." He read part of Walter's words aloud. People listened. Some cried, some nodded silently, and in that moment, something unspoken was released. Not grief, not guilt, permission. The park filled slowly but steadily. People brought lawn chairs, blankets, even cookies. Some sat quietly, others chatted. There was laughter, but also stillness, the kind that comes when something sacred is about to begin. One by one, seniors took the mic. A woman named Carol shared how she regretted never learning to swim. A man named Pete confessed he hadn't spoken to his brother in 20 years and planned to call him after this. A retired nurse shared how she used to sing but hadn't since her husband passed. Then she sang. No judgment, no applause, just connection. George listened, heart wide open. He felt what Walter must have felt when writing those letters. The urgency to say what needs to be said before it's too late. Then Jake whispered, "You should say something else, Grandpa, something real." George stood again, this time without notes. "I spent 5 years believing my life was winding down, but I was wrong. What I really did was stop participating. I stopped saying yes. I stopped moving my body. I stopped telling the people I love how much they mean to me. That ends now." He looked around, old faces, young eyes. This isn't about regret, it's about redemption, because as long as you can breathe, you can begin again. The crowd stood in silence. Then, one by one, they clapped. Not because it was a performance, but because it was truth. That afternoon, something shifted. In George, in Jake, in everyone who showed up. It wasn't just an event. It was a reset button. The following week, George sat at his desk, the same desk where he used to grade papers. Now, it held something far more personal, a blank sheet of paper. He picked up his pen and began to write. "Dear friend, if you're reading this, you're 60, maybe 65. You've still got time, more than you think. Don't wait to fix things. Don't wait to love louder. Don't wait to forgive, or to move, or to learn something completely new. You're not too old. You're just finally old enough to do it right. The regrets I had at 71 were echoes from choices I made in silence. Don't stay silent. Don't live inside routines so tight you forget to stretch your soul. Get up. Call someone. Tell your story. And if you're afraid, that just means it matters." He signed it, George, then folded the paper, sealed it in an envelope, and labeled it for someone who still has time. That night, as he stood in front of the mirror brushing his teeth, George looked into his own eyes again, but this time he didn't see age. He saw someone awake, someone useful, someone not finished. As he turned off the light and walked to bed, Jake sent him a message. "Let's go hiking next weekend, just us." George replied, "Sounds great. I'll bring the trail mix." And as he closed his eyes, one thought settled in his heart. I may be in the final chapters, but the story's not over.